My name is Damian Riggi. I am the broadcast production teacher here at the Lehigh Valley Charter High School for the Arts. I charged my students with the task of producing a video about a topic that would broaden their global horizons. Would the topic be something investigative? Could it be about something controversial? The topic that we arrived at was investigating the effects of the 2011 tsunami and corresponding disaster that occurred at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant station in Japan. The effects of this incident were felt around the world, and it caused us to take a broader look at the nuclear industry and how nuclear incidents are handled around the globe, both in the past and in the future. I hope you enjoy this video.
On March 11, 2011, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake out in the Pacific Ocean, followed by a 15-meter tall tsunami, disabled the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant's power supply, and their cooling systems failed. The reactor cores all partially melted down.
Consequently, I have to believe that these power plants were probably built pretty well, although I guess they didn't pick maybe the best location for them. These things are built to withstand like a 747 crashing directly in them. But obviously Mother Nature can throw a much bigger curveball than a 747 jet could. So obviously a tsunami was enough to disrupt that whole operation.
Did I think that at the same time Fukushima would have been hit by a tsunami and an earthquake? Probably not. But then I think somebody should have.
I wonder how many accidents have happened at these plants that we've just never even heard about.
Hi, I'm Eliana Velez.
And I'm Stuart Raveling.
And we're students from Lehigh Valley Charter High School for the Arts here at 3 Mile Island talking about the possible link between the disaster here years ago and the 2011 disaster at Fukushima Daiichi.
Right behind us at 3 Mile Island in 1979, the reactor went into a partial meltdown. We're trying to draw conclusions about what happened at Fukushima, what happened here. Let's get to the facts. On June 16, 1945, America explodes the first atomic bomb in New Mexico, only 3 years after they learned to control nuclear fission reactions. 2 months after that, they drop Little Boy and Fat Man on Japan.
See, that is a fundamental ethical issue that we struggle with. I've actually struggled with this for close to 25 years of my professional life, is the idea of nuclear energy versus nuclear weapons. I mean, it's basically the same technology.
In 1948, the US drives the natives out of their homes and conducts nuclear tests on Bikini Atoll. The hydrogen bomb that was dropped on Bikini in 1951, Bravo, was 1,000 times more powerful than Little Boy and Fat Man, and had affected people 125 miles east of the island. After 23 detonations, they finally ended the nuclear testing in 1958.
I don't think we think of the social cost of nuclear power. I don't think we think of the social cost of any technology before it started. It's always kind of an after-the-fact situation. We usually wait until a disaster happens to begin to ask and answer any of the questions necessary.
On April 26, 1986, the world's worst nuclear accident happened at Chernobyl, Ukraine, and let out a massive amount of radiation. The radiation killed 28 of the workers within the first 4 months, and another 106 workers were diagnosed with acute radiation sickness after that. If you look up why the accident occurred, you'll probably find something like this. According to the NRC, on April 26, 1986, a sudden surge of power during a reactor system test destroyed Unit 4 of the nuclear power station at Chernobyl, Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union. The accident and fire that followed released massive amounts of radioactive material into the environment. And that's about all you'll find. We found it a little peculiar that a sudden surge of power could create an explosion this harmful without having any idea of where this power surge even came from or why it happened. We interviewed Fedor Alexanderkovich of the film Russian Woodpecker to get some answers from him on why he believes the accident at Chernobyl happened.
In Soviet time, absolutely all information was closed, not only about Chernobyl. All was the secret and the mystification, and Chernobyl catastrophe creates a very big panic. This catastrophe in reality destroys Soviet Union. That is, after Chernobyl catastrophe begins a process of glasnost and democracy, and that is nobody believe for government after Chernobyl catastrophe.
I think it was pure human arrogance. What happened was they took too many control rods out of the reactor. The reactor, in an order of milliseconds, went critical, they tell me. They thought for sure that if something happened, they could get the control rods back in. They had turned off safety features. They thought for sure that they could turn back on the safety features. They were just plain wrong. They understood, they did not appreciate the power of the technology that they were trying to work with.
I don't agree that is the all political Soviet Union was the not speak truth and speak all time lies. All time. In time of Chernobyl, I think that is not about catastrophe. It's about especially panic.
To me, the major social implication of Chernobyl, and I've read quite a bit about this, is are we merely survivors of our technological advance? They've gone back on anniversaries and talked to people, and they get a sense that the happiness is gone. It's kind of the shadow. They call it, well, I've heard a colleague comment on it, called it the shadow of Chernobyl still hangs over the people of Pripyat, the people of Kiev.
On March 28, 1979, in Harrisburg, PA, a nuclear power plant's second reactor partially melted down and caused the most serious U.S. commercial nuclear power plant accident in history. According to the NRC, although TMI-2 suffered a severe core meltdown, the most dangerous kind of nuclear power accident, consequences outside the plant were minimal. Unlike the Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents, TMI-2's containment building remained intact and held almost all of the accident's radioactive material. A combination of personal error, design deficiencies, and component failures caused the 3 Mile Island accident, which permanently changed both the nuclear industry and the NRC. Public fear and distrust increased, the NRC's regulation and oversight became broader and more robust, and management of the plants were scrutinized more carefully.
In the long run, I'm not so sure there was that much social impact of 3 Mile Island, but that was just a leak.
My name is Christine Lehman. I lived within the 5-mile radius of 3 Mile Island. I started a Facebook group basically because I realized that people needed to talk. They needed a place to go and tell things that were happening to them without fear of ridicule. I had gone through a lot of issues with health over the years. Ones that doctors just said was stress. Some of them were like I had lesions on my brain, I had goiter, nodules on my thyroid. I had symptoms of MS. Then I was diagnosed with a stage 3 melanoma in 2010. My family all have issues. My mom had a tumor on her brain. My brother had tumors up and down his spine. My sister was diagnosed with bipolar schizophrenia in her 40s, which is pretty much not the norm. My daughter had cervical cancer. My granddaughter was born with a mild form of spina bifida. Before all this, no history of cancer in our family.
There was a Penn State study recently that did verify that there is a correlation between the number of thyroid cancers related to TMI. It was reported locally, maybe in Pennsylvania, but I don't know where else. But I think what you're doing, looking at Fukushima and looking here, is a great start because we have to get the story out.
3 Mile Island here did cause cancers. And there's also evidence from people that are supposedly also very smart saying, no, it's coincidental, and, so I don't know how we know who we can trust.
Were they lied to? Maybe. I think it more goes back to the fact of, I think you can see this in all aspects of engineering disasters that I've studied over the last 25 years, we just don't know.
My radiation doctor told me that thyroid cancer in the Midwest is basically unheard of. But you come here, she came here because there was work here.
Statistically, yes, there was a much higher level of incidence of cancer, but quantitatively, I don't think they could ever prove it.
There's a lot of thyroid cancers here and a lot of different types. Hashimoto's. I had Hashimoto's disease, which I stated before, and that comes from radiation exposure. It's time to tell the truth, and it's time to maybe help some of those victims that really don't have the resources to help themselves.
Yes, there was an increase. I think the numbers were increased. But could it be from some other reason? I know that there are people that are concerned about the number of truck bays that are being built in the Lehigh Valley. And they're thinking within 10 or 15 years, we may see an increase in lung cancer. Well, now, would that come from 3 Mile Island? Would that come from the truck bays? My problem is we just don't know.
The incident at Fukushima released tons of radiation into the air and into the ocean. But what exactly is radiation? What kind of effects does it have on us, short-term and long-term?
The world is made of 92 different things. There's things like iron and copper, carbon and oxygen. So there's 92 unique elements. Some of those elements don't change and have been that way since they were created in the star a zillion years ago. But some of them do change. They decay. They give off energy and become a different element.
Basically, there are 3 primary types of nuclear radiation: alpha, beta, and gamma. All of these types of radiation occur when an unstable atom tries to regain stability.
So radiation is when an unstable element gives off energy in the form of either an X-ray, something called a gamma ray, and that'll blow right through you, or a particle, a beta particle, or an alpha particle.
Alpha radiation occurs when the proton to neutron ratio in a nucleus is too large for an atom, therefore making the atom unstable. Because every atom wants to be stable, the atom will try to lose 2 protons and 2 neutrons, thus creating and releasing an alpha particle into the air. Alpha radiation, however, is the weakest form of the 3 primary types and is so weak that it can be blocked by a couple inches of air, your skin, or a piece of paper because it has a lot of mass. Beta radiation occurs when a neutron in a nucleus turns into a proton by emitting a high-level electron into the air. Because it has very little mass, it is more dangerous than alpha radiation and can get through a piece of paper or your skin. It is stopped by a sheet of metal or aluminum a couple of millimeters thick. Gamma radiation occurs when a nucleus lowers its energy level in order to become more stable and releases a gamma ray. Because it is a ray of light, it has no mass and can travel for a long distance without being stopped, making gamma radiation the most dangerous of the 3. Gamma radiation can't be blocked by a piece of paper, your skin, or a thin sheet of metal, but it can be stopped by several inches of lead, concrete, or steel. All 3 types of radiation have negative effects on a person's health and cause cancer when a person is exposed to them for a long enough time.
The problem with radiation, however, is it's silent. You can't see it. You can't see it if it gets in the drinking water. You can't see it if it gets in the food.
Messing with radioactive material is a dangerous, or can be a very, very dangerous profession, because no dose is good dose.
You know, let's look at this glass of water here. Let's say this is all radioactivity, and it has a half-life of 1 year. What that means is that half this glass will disintegrate, will give off energy, and half will be left in a year. The next year, half of what was there disintegrates. So now you're down to a quarter of the glass is of radioactive material. So half-life means however many atoms you start with, half of them disappear in a half-life.
We have to monitor these things so after they go through so many half-lives and they get to a point where they're no longer a hazard in accordance with NRC rules and regulations, then you can dispose them in ordinary refuse. You don't have to bury them or anything of that sort.
The rule of thumb is you go to half, and then half of that, and then half of that, and half of that. The rule of thumb is in 10 half-lives, so a 30-year half-life in 300 years, there's almost none in the environment, maybe 20 half-lives, but eventually that element decays away. But what's interesting is that those elements decay away to other things that are also radioactive. Plutonium, when it decays away, decays to americium. And americium is radioactive, and then it decays away. So you're right. The radiation stays in the environment forever. It changes its form, and eventually, perhaps a million years from now, it will have completely stopped being radioactive.
Obviously, the ones at Fukushima that are most concerned are the plutonium and the cesium-137, because they're going to hang around for a long time. It's going to take years for those to dissipate. In fact, the plutonium, it's going to hang around for many, many, many generations thereafter.
How do we know this radiation came from Fukushima? When Fukushima blew up, it emitted cesium-134 and 137. Well, 134 has a 2-year half-life. 137 is a 30-year half-life. So when you see 134 in a sample, you know it came from Fukushima because it didn't come from a bomb 60 years ago. A 2-year half-life says it's all going to be gone by 20 years. So the nuclear industry has always said, well, that cesium must have come from bomb testing. No, it didn't come from bomb testing. The cesium in the soil right now is from Fukushima.
To me, the whole problem is, too, it's not thought out. What do you do with the waste?
How do you decommission a nuclear power plant? How are they going to decommission 3 Mile Island? 3 Mile Island's still sitting there. I don't know. I know they're bringing down the percentage of energy that they're getting from that, but you don't just close the door, turn the lights out.
And I hear talk about bringing back nuclear power and rebuilding plants, but you have not solved the waste problem.
I'm sure you remember this when you went to 3 Mile Island. That's an enormous site. That's acres and acres and acres that have to be remediated.
I heard they were taking some and putting them in tubes and throwing them in the bottom of the ocean. That is ludicrous. That thing's sitting back there, they're closing it down for a reason, and that's going to sit there and rot. They say it's going to be safe. Well, they told us that before.
Somebody really messed this up bad. They changed our lives. It changed who we could have been. It changed the health we could have had. But to them, there's still no adverse health effects from the accident of 3 Mile Island.
The thing about the Fukushima accident was it went into the ocean. What's it going to do in our oceans? It's floating around in our ocean. And, ocean currents, it could take it anywhere.
There's really no way to clean it. Once it gets into the ocean, it just has to dissipate. There's just no way to remove it. There's no way to de-radioactivate it, too. Once it's radioactive, it has to decay within the scope of the radioactive decay law. The object of the game is, if you have an accident like this, is to try to contain it immediately. And that in itself has its challenges, obviously, especially under the circumstances of Fukushima, where they had to deal with a tsunami. That in itself is an extremely expensive and labor-intensive task. They're seeing things in the Pacific Northwest that's transversed the Pacific Ocean, and they're finding some traces of radioactivity in the water. It's all throughout the Pacific. However, the currents take the contamination of where they end up. People are monitoring these things just to see if there's if there's any real heavy concentration, then those areas have to be quarantined, or I'm not sure what they would do, to be honest, but like I said, it'd be quite an undertaking, quite a task.
Here are some of the environmental issues since the disaster. High radiation concentrations in new leaves, and at least in the case of cedar and pollen. Apparent increases in growth mutations of fir trees with rising radiation levels. Heritable mutations in pale bluegrass butterfly populations and DNA-damaged worms in highly contaminated areas, as well as apparent reduced fertility in barn swallows. Decreases in the abundance of 57 bird species with higher radiation levels over a 4-year contamination of one of the world's most important ecosystems, coastal estuaries.
The fish, they're not getting so much irradiated from the contamination so much as that they swim through the water and the water gets ingested through their system, and that's where the particulates are going to collect within them. Not like they're getting exposed from a distance and the radiation is traveling and it's striking their outside. They're actually ingesting the water from their breathing process. So consequently, A lot of the particulates, radioactive matter, if you will, are being lodged in their system. And so, of course, once that happens, then it's going to affect their DNA and the reproductive cycle, and they're either produce offspring that have defects, or there may be some cancer of some sort that will eventually destroy their own system. It could be any number of things, but that's typically, I would think, what would happen. I don't know how well they've been able to clean it. I don't know how well they've been able to collect it and store it, but certainly where the damaged reactor core is, that's going to be the real hot zone.
It becomes hard to trust this system, though. At Fukushima, there was an underestimation in its design. The plant wasn't made to sustain that level of tsunami.
In Fukushima, before understanding that is not so big wave possible, and that is mistake. The big mistake why Fukushima exists. The calculation of wave was mistake. The understanding of location of this station, of build this station.
Actually, the data did exist. A simple Google search on tsunami data returns a searchable NOAA database. This database clearly shows tsunamis up to 90 meters, over double the height of the 2011 tsunami at Fukushima. But tsunami is not the only concern while building a reactor in Japan.
Should we build nuclear power plants on faults out in California and Nevada out there? No, and we don't.
But Japan did. Japan has the largest nuclear power plant in the world, Kashiwazaki Karira. 4 years before the Fukushima disaster, there was an earthquake at the plant. The plant is very close to 23 seismic fault lines. Contaminated water got into the sea. The plant was designed to sustain a 6.5 magnitude earthquake, and here they had a 6.8. It caused leaks and malfunctions all over, and has remained closed since the accident.
And so I think that was another issue of why it was built there in the first place. Because if it wasn't, if it was inland, you and I wouldn't be speaking about Fukushima right now, because it wouldn't have happened.
Maybe in Fukushima problem it's same as Chernobyl. It's if Chernobyl spent more money as need, in Fukushima spent not enough money. That is problem is in money each time.
The history of radiation in America and in the world has been one of cover-ups. When the bomb testing occurred, there were scientists who discovered a meaningful increase in stillbirths in the counties surrounding the area where the bomb burst occurred. In the 1950s, there was a meltdown at a reactor 40 miles outside of the center of LA. At the Santa Susana reactor, there was a meltdown, and I didn't even know about it, and I was a nuclear engineer, and I didn't even know about it until the 1990s when some very good investigative reporters started to dig into it. You go on to 3 Mile Island, and the work with Dr. Henry Meyer. Henry's report is on the Fairwind site, by the way. And Henry clearly shows that the government, our government, and the people that own 3 Mile Island deliberately minimized the event. People should have gone to jail, and in fact, no one did. Then came Fukushima. And remember, I had been actively involved on TMI, and I could see the same lies happening from the Japanese government and from Tokyo Electric, the people that own Fukushima. Within 2 days of the meltdown, the Japanese were saying the same things I heard on 3 Mile Island. And I said, they were lying at 3 Mile Island, and they're not telling the truth now.
You can see the way of money and what is the problem in the money. And if you found this connection, you found person who maybe knew more about this.
The cover-up in Japan is extensive. Doctors were told to alter medical records to show that serious radiation-related injuries are due to stress. They were told that they'll lose their hospital privileges and they won't be paid for the work if they write down that the illness is caused by radiation. Now, what that's doing for scientists like me is making the epidemiological record really difficult to discover. when we go back years from now, we look at the number of people that died and try to get their medical records, and we find stress, that doesn't tell us anything. And it's deliberately designed to make the epidemiology in the future almost impossible.
But the other problem that you have, and this was one of the justifications for Chernobyl, was panic. You don't want to start, could you imagine if the governor of Pennsylvania made, I mean, it would have been such an incredible panic. And I'm not so sure that would have been all that good.
And normal government, normal destroy panic.
I think in 3 Mile Island, if I were in charge, I would have erred a little bit more on the side of caution. But to be fair, the government did say pregnant women and children should leave the 3 Mile Island area within 48 hours. And that, I think, was the responsible thing to do.
In really panic, that is the problem.
It was chaotic. And whether if they told us the truth or not, there was panic. They should have been honest.
I think at the time of the accident, I think the government didn't know. I mean, I really fault the company because the company was changing its numbers, falsifying things. There was concern among us that we didn't want a mass exodus because there was no evacuation route. Nothing had been planned. I mean, that's one thing that came out of TMI. Now there are evacuation routes. Another thing that came out of TMI is, I believe, for corporations and companies, they realized they needed to have some sort of public relations policy because you can't put an engineer in front of reporters talking and saying one thing and not telling the truth. I like to say, you know, TMI, too much information, but back then it was TLI, too little information. We really didn't know what was going on. And I think what the government knew at the time, they wanted to be conservative because they didn't want people going crazy. But in hindsight, now that we know, there obviously was more damage done than we thought, and there should have been an evacuation.
Panic, it's big dangerous. I understand why in Fukushima government say it's normal.
The Japanese government and the nuclear industry would say that meltdowns at Fukushima hardly killed anybody. They'll probably say maybe 10 to 100 people might die from a meltdown radioactivity released from Fukushima. That's a lie. They have a vested interest in minimizing the health effects because they want, one, to get these nukes back running in Japan, and two, they want to build more.
The governing body of the Japanese power plants, TEPCO, had to shut down all 17 of their plants in 2002 because they were caught lying about safety data. When the accident at Kashiwazaki happened in 2007, TEPCO was very slow to report the leaks, and only 4 employers were available on site to handle the transformer fire.
There's a lot of independent scientists who will say that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are going to develop cancers, other organ damage that's going to shorten their life. And then beyond that, there's the genetic damage too. And that doesn't show up in the first generation. That shows up in the second and especially the third generation of people exposed.
But I think too that this government and atomic scientific not understand the process inside reactor.
I met with Naoto Kan. Now he was the prime minister and he was an engineer. And he said I said to him, Prime Minister, considering what you knew at the time, I think you did the right thing. And he turned to me and he says, Arnie, through an interpreter, he says, Arnie, the information I received from my regulator and from Tokyo Electric was neither timely nor accurate. So that's a direct quote. The information I received was neither timely nor accurate. So if the industry was willing to lie to the Prime Minister of Japan, it's no wonder that they're willing to bamboozle the citizens there.
Who is better to determine risk of 3 Mile Island again having a problem? The professional risk assessor for the state of Pennsylvania or up at MIT, or the grandmother who walks her grandchildren within the shadow of the cooling towers?
They should have told us the day the accident happened. The day the accident happened, I was here, right here, walking the trails with my 4-year-old daughter. You can see those towers from here.
And I've read some things about a grandmother, and she was asked, "Why are you scared?" And her response was brilliant. She says, "I don't know, I just am." And that tends to be a little bit discounted.
And certain people you say something to, they'll laugh at you if they don't have any skin in the game.
The study from Dr. Goldenberg, he opened up Pandora's box. There will be more studies. The world is going to know the truth, whether if they admit it or not.
Radiation used to be determined safe if you could get less than 100 millirem of radiation. But just remember 100 was the limit. And it still is the limit. But what the Japanese did is they said, well, for the people that were exposed in a disaster, that 100 doesn't count anymore, and in fact it can be 2,000 millirem. They basically had a 20-fold increase in the radiation level. And what they did was they said, we can't meet that old standard of 100 millirem. It's impossible to clean up Fukushima Prefecture, which is about the size of Connecticut, and make that radiation level down to 100. So rather than do that, or rather than move everybody out, we're going to raise the limit 20 times higher.
I think there is something to consider that I learned this on a panel, that the limits are set on male bodies and not female bodies. I mean, when you think of blood alcohol content for a woman versus a man, so as far as I know, the limits are based on males, and it's the women who produce the children. So I wonder what the real limits are for women.
I think you also bring up a very interesting question, and one that's a lot more complicated, I think, than people think, as to why the radiation levels were raised. I think that, again, is what I consider the kind of the human arrogance of all this. As I mentioned before, Chernobyl. We saw the worst, and we survived. 3 Mile Island, yes, there has been an increase in cancer rates. But you drive through Middletown, central Pennsylvania, it hasn't changed that much.
My thought on that is that if the government lied to us, who's to say that anybody can believe what level is safe? They will not be honest about it. All I can say about that is people have become expendable for profit. And that's pretty much the bottom line. They'll say what they need to say to make the almighty dollar.
It was because of money. They basically have said that the people who live there will have to have 20 times the risk of getting a cancer as opposed to what they would have at the old standard. Now, the United States did something similar right after Fukushima, again because of financial ramifications. They had a 10-fold increase.
3 Mile Island should have been our wake-up call, because nothing did happen. But I think people said, okay, well, I know in the Challenger, in the space shuttle, they knew there was a potential problem with the O-rings. Launches and launches before Challenger. But reading some of the studies, my understanding is every subsequent launch, they lowered the risk. Why? We launched and nothing happened. Do we need technological catastrophes to happen? And the older I get and the more I study this, the more I'm saying, I don't know if we need them, but I think they could be very useful. I think the data that can come from it from a social perspective could be absolutely fabulous.
It's a financial game. Remember the movie Follow the Money. It's all about the cost of the cleanup. The companies don't want to take the financial hit, so they're willing to expose civilians to a radiation risk that, in my mind, is wrong. It's just way too high.
Why should they trust? I don't know that they should. I think it's also unfair, using Chernobyl as a guide, it's a little unfair because a lot of the people that went back post-Chernobyl wanted to go back.
You've obviously been affected by TMI, all three of you, and my question is, why do you stay here if you have been affected so deeply by it, and you think that there's a potential that there's still radiation in this area? Why do you still continue to live here?
I'm a homebody, so where would I go? My family's rooted here, the damage was done, and I didn't know how bad that it would get. And by then, my roots were deep here. Where do you go? You leave your family. I went out to Salt Lake City and lived for a while. I got homesick, so I came home. Damage is done.
It's their home. There was a great documentary about an 85-year-old woman who actually snuck back in before she was ever supposed to, and a camera crew caught up with her and asked her why. And she said, "I was born here. I want to die here."
But the thing about Fukushima is that a lot of these people don't want to go back. I mean, here we are more than 6 years after the accident, and they're still cleaning up miles away from the plant. 160,000 people left their homes after the accident, and half of them haven't even come back home.
I think we have to look at these cases through the lens of the people that are moving back. I'm lucky. I am an upper middle class professional. I have other opportunities. There was a study I read a long time ago. Again, I don't know many numbers on it, but they went back to talk to the people of Bhopal. And they asked the people of Bhopal, even some of those who were critically injured during the chemical leak, if the plant opened tomorrow, would you go back if you were given your job? A lot of them said yes. And they asked why? And they said, we have no other choice.
The government was paying for temporary housing for the voluntary evacuees. So imagine this, you've got your regular mortgage payment to make on a house you can't live in, and because the government subsidy was shut down, good luck affording housing on your own. They pretty much have to go back, and 6 years later, they're still cleaning up.
We must understand that this government is without face speaking. We must understand who exactly decides this. It's not government, not people. Each problem have one person. Maybe this person incorrect make. Maybe especially, maybe not especially. We must understand. We must find this concrete person and work with this problem.
Candidates now that are running for, say, governor, different positions within this area, they don't want to talk about nuclear. I called and talked to, and I'm politically active, and I called and talked to somebody, and I said, hey, Will, so-and-so, because I don't want to name anybody, would they be willing to talk about nuclear energy and what happened to us? Oh, no. And I'm friends with the lady that I was talking to. Oh, no, that's a hot issue that we don't want to talk about. So they don't want to talk about it. They're still trying to sweep it under the rug because what do you do about it? You know, what are you going to do? That's the long term. And the bottom line is they're waiting for us to die off.
Either we didn't have the social will, or the Yucca Mountains, the political will to do something. Maybe we don't have the technological capabilities to reprocess nuclear fuel.
Even here at 3 Mile Island, you know, we asked them for a general interview several times, and we were instead directed to websites by the PR person. Now that doesn't imply that anyone at Exelon is guilty of anything, but look, it just shows you how closed off this industry can be.
I had a young lady in my ethics seminar. One of the first years I taught my ethics seminar, and she came into class every Tuesday and Thursday morning with 2 of the most beautifully greasy breakfast sandwiches you'll ever see. Egg, cheese, bacon, right? Ate them during class. And I said to her, you know, I would love to see your arteries in about 20 years. And without hesitation, she looked at me and she said, sir, You're a biomedical engineer. In 20 years, you will have solved that problem. That, I think, is a fundamental sociological problem of technology. We think that technology is the answer to solve problems of technology.
At TMI, our government said nobody's hurt. And they still say that on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission website. It says no one died after TMI. And that's not true. And so these people are living with illnesses and the expectancy that it wasn't caused by the nuclear reactor they lived right next to. I got an email from a woman who was a student at Middletown High School which is right outside of TMI. And they had a radiation detector in the window of the chemistry class because in the weeks before that they were studying radiation. And every day it would click a couple times indicating it was just a cosmic ray or something. And on the day of the disaster, she wrote to me in the email that the Geiger counter was pegged. It was just screaming. There was so much radiation that was being detected. And her teacher called the governor's office and said, I'm in Middletown High School. We've got radiation off the charts. And the governor's office said, we know. Don't do anything about it. So it's not just the Japanese. It's our government as well.
Wow. Politics, it's not atomic physics. It's a very simple man who not have education of physicists, and he not help. He must one or two things: not panic for people. People must be comfortable, and I must found soldiers, and that is terrible situation. So, but not panic. It's a work of politics and work of government. We must understand this too.
As regular people, we can't really prove or disprove those things. We don't have the education. We don't have the knowledge. We have to trust what we're being told.
Just because you're alive today doesn't mean that an internal organ or your genetic code hasn't been altered and altered in a bad way.
Just because we don't have more accidents doesn't necessarily mean we are all right.
Hopefully it'll be a safer place for the future generations. The damage is done with us, but maybe we can make a difference for the future.
Institutional memory is a sociological concept where institutions do not remember things that happened from the past. To paraphrase the philosopher George Santayana, history will repeat itself if it is allowed to be forgotten.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Stuart Raveling.
And I'm Eliana Velez, and we're both from Lehigh Valley Charter High School for the Arts.